Imagine a battlefield where distinguishing between soldiers and civilians becomes incredibly difficult, blurring lines that international humanitarian law strives to keep clear. Deliberate intermingling in international humanitarian law refers to the practice by armed groups, often non-state actors, of intentionally locating military objectives or personnel within or near civilian populations, civilian objects, or protected areas. This tactic aims to shield combatants or military assets from attack by exploiting the protections afforded to civilians under the laws of armed conflict. The reason this practice is so problematic stems directly from the fundamental principle of distinction, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. This principle mandates that parties to an armed conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives. Attacks may only be directed against military objectives. When an armed group deliberately intermingles, they make it exceedingly difficult for the opposing force to target legitimate military objectives without causing incidental harm to civilians or civilian objects, which could violate the principle of proportionality. This strategy therefore directly undermines the core protections designed to minimize civilian suffering during conflict. Understanding this concept means recognizing that deliberate intermingling does not absolve an attacking force of its obligations under international humanitarian law. Even when an enemy deliberately intermingles, an attacking party must still take all feasible precautions to avoid, or at least minimize, civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. This includes refraining from attacks if the expected civilian harm would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. It also means that the presence of civilians does not render an otherwise legitimate military target immune from attack, but it does impose a higher burden of care and precaution on the attacker. An interesting nuance here is that while deliberate intermingling is deeply problematic and unethical, international humanitarian law does not explicitly prohibit combatants from operating among the civilian population in all circumstances, especially for non-state armed groups who may not have dedicated military bases. However, it is the deliberate exploitation of civilian presence to deter attacks on military targets that constitutes this wrongful intermingling. This is distinct from a mere proximity that might occur in urban warfare settings, which also presents significant challenges but may not involve the same intent to use civilians as shields. Ultimately, grasping the concept of deliberate intermingling helps us understand one of the most complex challenges in modern armed conflict for upholding the principle of distinction and protecting civilians. It highlights why all parties must respect international humanitarian law, continuously striving to separate military operations from civilian life, thereby mitigating the profound human costs of war.